An alien revealed a hidden truth about Jesus that could change everything, and the moment I heard it, I understood why humanity was never meant to know. It wasn't a prophecy, or a miracle, or a secret locked in ancient scripture. It was a truth, so old, so destabilizing, that every belief system on Earth had been shaped to keep it hidden. When Astra emerged from the shadows and revealed what Jesus truly came here to awaken, my entire understanding of reality cracked in half. Because if this revelation is true, then everything we believe about divinity and who we are has been only a fragment of the real story. Before we begin, like this video, share it with someone who still believes we're alone, and don't forget to subscribe. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Step carefully, because what happened next inside that empty hospital chapel is where everything changed. The hospital always felt different after midnight, but something about that hour felt heavier than usual. James had spent another night guiding families through the final breaths of the people they loved, and by the time the clock read 3:11 in the morning, he felt the familiar weight behind his ribs, that quiet ache that came from watching too much suffering in a single lifetime. He walked toward the chapel not for prayer but for silence, for a moment where the world stopped clinging to him. The chapel was always empty at that hour, always still, always predictable. But when he pushed the door open, the air shifted in a way that made every instinct in him freeze. There was someone inside. At first, he thought it was a trick of exhaustion. A silhouette sitting in the front pew beneath the crucifix. Too tall, too still, too perfectly outlined by the dim blue light leaking in from the hallway behind him. James blinked, rubbed his face with both hands, and looked again. The figure remained, and then something stranger happened. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, as if responding to his presence, drawing him in instead of pushing him away. He took one slow step forward, and the air seemed to thicken like warm gravity. The figure was not a patient, not a visitor, not anyone who belonged in the quiet of that chapel. As James approached, the faint glow around the being strengthened, and he saw details that stole the air from his lungs. Skin with a soft luminescence, like moonlight reflected in deep water. A posture too fluid to be human. No movement, no breath, simply presence, as though the entire room was holding itself around this one impossible being. James felt his pulse stumble. He did not speak. The being did not turn its head or shift. It simply waited, as if it had known he would come, as if his footsteps had been counted long before he took them. James reached the aisle closest to the figure, and instinct told him to retreat, to run, to call security, to do anything except stand there. But something deeper, something he could not explain, held him in place. A magnetic quiet filled the chapel, thick with a meaning he could sense but not understand. Then something happened that made the room feel smaller, as if all the walls had leaned inward. Without moving its mouth, without even turning toward him, the being spoke, not out loud, but directly into his mind, a voice without sound yet clearer than any whisper he had ever heard. It told him that it had been waiting, not for the world, not for humanity, but for him. James's breath caught, and his thoughts scattered. The voice continued, steady and calm, carrying an authority that felt older than the building, older than the city, older than anything he had ever encountered. It told him that it had not come to harm him, nor to frighten him, but to correct something humanity had misunderstood for thousands of years. Something that had shaped nations, wars, hope, fear, and belief. Something so deeply buried that even those who claimed to guard the truth had never truly seen it. The being told him it had come to reveal what humanity had gotten wrong about Jesus. And in that moment, the chapel no longer felt like a place of silence. It felt like the threshold of something ancient, waking up. James stood frozen in the chapel, unable to breathe, unable to think. The glowing presence before him radiated a calmness that felt unnatural, as if the air itself flowed around the being instead of through it. He wanted to speak, but his voice remained trapped somewhere behind his heartbeat. Then, without movement or sound, a word pressed into his mind with quiet certainty: Astra. The name arrived not as a whisper but as something placed gently into his thoughts, as if the being had reached inside his consciousness and set it there with deliberate care. James felt a tremor ripple through him. The name felt ancient, older than scripture, older than language, resonating with a depth he could not explain. Astra continued speaking without speaking, the communication arriving as pure understanding rather than sentences. He called himself a witness of origin, a term that vibrated with an unsettling weight. James sensed that it was not a title, but a role from a realm beyond time, a designation belonging to a being that had watched humanity far longer than humanity had existed. The thought alone made his stomach tighten. A witness of origin. A witness to what origin? Whose origin? The questions tangled together, and the chapel seemed colder. Then another realization pressed into him. Astra claimed to have been present during the lifetime of Jesus. The statement hit James with the force of a collapsing world. His mind scrambled for explanations. Hallucination, stress, exhaustion, anything that did not require him to believe the impossible. But the presence was so real, so undeniably present, that denial felt thin and childish. Images flickered at the edges of his thoughts, impressions of distant deserts, crowds, a man speaking with a voice that resonated beyond the flesh. Whether they were memories or projections, he could not tell. His rational world, the one built on medicine and procedure, and the quiet, practical reality of death, began to fracture. He had spent years assuring families that death was simple, that nothing waited beyond the heartbeat's final rhythm. Now, a luminous being claimed that he had stood beside Jesus, had witnessed events long buried beneath dogma and time. James felt the weight of that revelation press into him, cold and heavy. The chapel, once familiar, now felt like a chamber where realities bled together. And in that trembling silence, James understood that nothing about his life would remain untouched by the truth that had just spoken its name inside his mind. The name Astra still echoed in James's mind, vibrating with a strange familiarity he could not place. The chapel felt suspended in a silence that was no longer natural, a silence that listened. James sensed the being was studying him, not with eyes but with an awareness that reached deeper than flesh or thought. Then, an impression pressed gently into his consciousness. Soft yet unshakable. Astra knew the question James had carried since childhood, the one he had never spoken aloud. Not to family, not to friends, not even in the privacy of his own prayers. That hidden question rose from the shadows of his memory like something long buried. Who was Jesus really? The words carried a tremor of fear and longing, a question born during James's earliest encounters with death, when he had seen suffering that did not match the promises he had been taught. Astra revealed that the answer was not simple, not clean, and not safely contained within the narrow walls of doctrine. The truth, he said without speaking, was far more beautiful than human belief allowed, and far more dangerous than any religion would ever dare admit. James felt the weight of that claim settle over him. His mind raced toward explanations he had been taught since childhood, teachings shaped by sermons and scripture, and the comfortable certainty that mysteries ended where faith began. Yet Astra's presence made those explanations feel small, like shadows cast by a flame too bright to ignore. James felt something deeper. A dawning awareness that the question he had carried was not just curiosity but a pull, a quiet summons toward something vast. The chapel lights flickered as if reacting to a shift James could not see. He realized that Astra's knowledge of his hidden question was not coincidence or intrusion but an invitation. an invitation into a truth that had waited for him across years of doubt, grief, and unanswered prayers. The air seemed to hum, alive with the gravity of what was coming. James understood that whatever Astra intended to reveal would not merely challenge his beliefs. It would unravel them, reshape them, and lead him into a reality where the story of Jesus was not just history, but something still unfolding. The air in the chapel grew denser, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. James felt Astra's presence coil around his thoughts with a gentleness that made his skin prickle. A realization washed through him, not spoken, not taught, but placed directly into the quiet space of his mind. Astra had not chosen him randomly. The truth carried a strange and unsettling weight. Astra revealed that James's years spent guiding people through their final breaths had shaped him in ways he never understood. Every moment of watching a heartbeat fade, every whispered comfort to a frightened soul, every silent vigil over a dying stranger had thinned something inside him. It had opened a softness, a thinning of the veil that separated one world from the next. He had believed exhaustion made him sensitive, that long nights and the toll of death simply wore him down. But Astra conveyed that the constant nearness to the dying had altered him. It had tuned him to frequencies most humans never notice, frequencies felt only in the fleeting moments between a final exhale and whatever comes after. James felt a shiver roll down his arms as Astra showed him the unseen truth. Each time someone passed, a sliver of that departing presence brushed against him, leaving subtle imprints he never recognized. Over years, those imprints shaped him into someone who could perceive what others could not. A question surfaced in his thoughts, heavy and quietly terrifying. Why him, and not scholars or priests or scientists who had spent lifetimes studying the mysteries of existence? Astra answered with another impression. Those who chase truth through intellect alone often build walls around themselves, walls of certainty, doctrine, and analysis. James had lived his life at the threshold of endings, where souls loosened from the world and vulnerability made all barriers fall. In that space, truth touched him without resistance. James felt the magnitude of it settle into his chest. Astra had manifested to him because he was open, not through belief, but through the countless moments he had held a cooling hand, whispered reassurance, or witnessed a final flicker of consciousness. He had unknowingly become a bridge, a quiet doorway between worlds. The silence in the chapel shifted again, settling into something deeper, as if the room itself braced for whatever Astra was about to reveal. The understanding arrived in James's mind like a slow unfurling, gentle in movement but immense in weight. Astra conveyed that one of humanity's oldest assumptions was wrong, not slightly wrong, but fundamentally inverted. Jesus had never come to build a religion. He had never intended temples, hierarchies, rigid rules, or systems that demanded unquestioning loyalty. His purpose had been something far more expansive, something rooted not in structure but in awakening. Astra showed James that Jesus came to demonstrate a universal energetic truth, a truth that pulsed beneath every atom of existence, a truth that connected all living beings through a field older than the stars themselves. This truth, Astra explained, was not meant to be owned, controlled, or codified. It was meant to be remembered. Jesus taught through presence rather than doctrine, through vibration rather than decree. Every healing, every word, every moment of compassion had been an illustration of what humans were capable of when aligned with the deeper fabric of creation. But humanity, frightened by the vastness of that freedom, reshaped his message into something safer, something smaller, something that could be governed, interpreted, and used to draw boundaries rather than dissolve them. Astra pressed the realization deeper. After Jesus left the physical world, people rushed to preserve what they believed he had meant, but in doing so, they lost the essence of what he had actually carried. Movements formed, Leaders emerged, and slowly the living truth became encased in ritual and rule. The universal law Jesus embodied transformed into fixed beliefs, guarded tightly by those who feared anything that challenged their authority. What had once been fluid became rigid. What had once been a path became a cage. James felt a tremor of awe mixed with dread. If Astra's revelation was true, the foundations of everything he had been taught were built on a misunderstanding. Jesus had not come to establish religion. He had come to reveal what human beings truly are. And humanity had forgotten almost all of it. A stillness settled inside the chapel that felt older than the building itself, as if the air remembered something long forgotten. James sensed another wave of understanding forming in his mind, a slow and deliberate unveiling shaped by Astra's presence. The next truth pressed into him with a weight that felt both impossible and inevitable. Jesus had not walked his path alone. From the earliest years of his life until the end of his earthly journey, he had been guided by 12 luminous intelligences, beings Astra called the Council of 12 Lights. Their presence did not resemble guardians or spirits, but something more ancient and intricately woven into the architecture of the universe. Astra conveyed that these 12 were not deities, nor were they bound to human concepts of angels. They existed in realms of frequency beyond physical form, watching over civilizations across ages. When Jesus incarnated, carrying a consciousness beyond ordinary human comprehension, the council manifested around him, not to command him, but to help him remember who he truly was beneath the limitations of the human body. James felt impressions rise in his mind, not memories but echoes of moments he could not possibly have witnessed. He sensed a young boy in Nazareth, waking from dreams he could not explain, feeling presence rather than seeing figures. The council communicated not through words but through resonance, adjusting his awareness, opening channels within him that most humans never access. These beings awakened dormant abilities inside Jesus, abilities tied to the universal energetic law he would someday demonstrate to the world. They guided him through moments of confusion, revelation, and profound isolation. Astra revealed that Jesus's extraordinary clarity, compassion, and capacity for healing did not come from a place above humanity, but from a place humanity had simply forgotten how to reach. The council illuminated that path for him, reminding him of his nature rather than granting him power. The miracles he performed were not gifts, but expressions of an awakened consciousness, shaped by the 12 who walked with him in silence. James felt a cold shiver as the magnitude of the revelation settled. If such beings existed, guiding him, awakening him, then the story humanity believed was not just incomplete. It was barely the beginning. The chapel dimmed around James as a new understanding unfolded in his mind. Like a curtain slowly rising to reveal a history never spoken aloud, Astra revealed that the life humanity believed it knew was only a fragment of the truth. Entire years of Jesus's journey had been erased, concealed, or misunderstood to fit a narrower story. Those silent years, the ones Scripture glossed over as if nothing significant occurred, were in fact the years that shaped him most profoundly. James felt Astra's revelation as vivid impressions rather than images, sensations of distant lands and forgotten teachings. He sensed long roads stretching through Persia, where spiritual scholars studied the hidden mechanics of consciousness long before such ideas reached the Western world. Jesus walked among mystics who understood the nature of energy, vibration, and the architecture of the soul. These teachings seeped into him not as doctrines, but as lived experience. Astra guided James further into these lost years, shifting the impressions toward India. James felt the presence of ancient masters who taught methods of inner stillness so deep that awareness could slip free from the confines of the body. Jesus absorbed their understanding, not to imitate them, but to weave their knowledge into his own unfolding remembrance. The practices he encountered there formed the foundation of the clarity he would later share through simple stories stories that carried truths far older than the culture he was born into. The journey continued into the high plateaus of Tibet, where the air thinned and the veil between worlds grew faint. James sensed monasteries tucked into mountains, like hidden chambers of the earth. There, Jesus encountered a lineage of teachers who studied the intersection of physical life and non-physical realms. Mastering the transition between states of consciousness, their teachings resonated with the universal law he carried within him, awakening abilities that lay dormant beneath the limits of the human form. Astra impressed upon James that these missing years were not a detour but the crucible in which Jesus' mastery was refined. What he later demonstrated to the world had been shaped by knowledge thousands of years older than any scripture. And humanity, unaware of this journey, built an entire belief system without understanding where the truth had actually begun. A hush settled inside the chapel as Astra revealed a moment James sensed was unlike anything that had come before. A turning point so profound it shifted the course of history in ways humanity never recognized. Astra called it the blooming, a name that carried the feeling of something opening rather than something beginning. James felt the impression of it forming inside him, not as a memory, but as a resonance, a vibration that made the air around him feel thinner, as if reality itself remembered the event. Astra conveyed that Jesus' awakening did not arrive gradually or gently. It came in a single, extraordinary moment when every fragment of his consciousness aligned with the deeper truth he carried. Jesus had spent years absorbing ancient teachings, traveling across lands where knowledge of the unseen was preserved in fragments. Yet even with that learning, he remained partially veiled, still bound to the limits of human perception. Then, during a period of intense solitude, something shifted. James sensed the scene, as if standing at the edge of it. A quiet night, a still expanse of desert. The world around Jesus paused, as if holding its breath. In that silence, a realization unfolded within him so complete that it dissolved every barrier between what he was and what he had forgotten. The blooming was not illumination. It was recognition, a sudden expansion of awareness that reconnected him to a field of consciousness stretching beyond time. Astra impressed upon James that during this moment, the fabric of reality bent around Jesus. The boundary between the physical world and the unseen grew thin, responding to the surge of his awakening. Time rippled. Space vibrated. The energies that shape existence shifted as if acknowledging the return of a familiar frequency. Witnesses did not understand what they saw, yet stories of strange lights, distortions, and unexplainable calm lingered in fragments of forgotten texts. After the blooming, Jesus no longer perceived the world as others did. His awareness expanded beyond the linear, beyond the ordinary confines of the mind. He walked with a clarity that made the impossible feel natural, and the natural feel incomplete. James felt a tremor run through him as the truth settled. The moment Jesus awakened, reality itself had responded. The chapel felt suspended in a stillness that bordered on unreal, as if the air itself anticipated what Astra was about to reveal. James sensed the next truth gathering like a slow darkening of the sky before a storm. It pressed into his mind with a weight that felt foreign and yet strangely familiar, as though part of him had always suspected it. The miracles of Jesus, the moments the world defined as divine intervention, were not acts of magic. They were demonstrations of a universal law, a law woven into the structure of existence long before the first human took a breath. Astra conveyed this not as theory, but as certainty, a truth anchored in the fabric of reality itself. James felt impressions rising within him, forming not images, but principles. Everything in creation vibrated. Everything responded to intention. Everything carried a blueprint that could be shifted when consciousness expanded beyond the limits of ordinary perception. Jesus understood this law intuitively, not because he was separated from humanity, but because he remembered what humanity had forgotten. Astra explained that Jesus' healing touch was not a gift bestowed from above, but the natural expression of an awakened mind, aligning another being's energetic pattern with a higher state of balance. When the blind saw, when the sick rose, when the broken were restored, Jesus was not defying nature. He was working with a deeper layer of it. James felt the chapel grow warmer as Astra pressed the revelation deeper. The stilling of storms, the stories of walking across water, the accounts of matter shifted by intention, were all manifestations of the same universal law. Jesus lived in resonance with that law, and the world around him responded. The seeming impossibilities occurred not because he bent the rules of reality, but because he understood them more fully than those who witnessed him. Everything he did was rooted in the principle that consciousness shapes experience, and an awakened consciousness shapes it profoundly. Astra conveyed that these abilities were not meant to be exclusive. They were not demonstrations of superiority or unreachable divinity. They were reminders. Jesus performed his miracles not to elevate himself, but to show humanity what lay dormant within them. The potential to heal, to transform, to influence the structure of one's life through intentional awareness was embedded in every human being. The limitation was never capability, but consciousness. Most people lived confined within layers of fear, conditioning, and belief so rigid they could not perceive the deeper currents shaping their existence. James felt a slow, unsettling realization settle into his chest. If Astra's words were true, then humanity had not been shown miracles to worship. They had been shown mirrors to awaken. Jesus had been demonstrating what an expanded consciousness could do, guiding humans toward a remembrance they were too frightened to embrace. The world had idolized the messenger and forgotten the message. And somewhere in that forgetting, the doorway to the universal law had grown dim. A quiet vibration settled over the chapel, a subtle hum beneath the stillness. As if the walls themselves recognized the truth Astra was preparing to reveal. James felt it before he understood it, a tightening in the air that made each breath feel heavier, as though he were standing at the threshold of a secret buried beneath centuries of misunderstanding. Astra began placing the knowledge into his mind with deliberate softness, allowing the truth to unfold layer by layer. Jesus' healing was not a disruption of nature, it was a mastery of it. He did not override the laws of the physical world. He worked through the deeper laws that shaped the physical world from beneath its surface. The human body, Astra conveyed, was not just flesh and bone, not merely a collection of cells responding to chemical signals. It was a luminous network of patterns, frequencies, and structures that extended beyond physical form. Beneath every organ, every nerve, every fiber of muscle, existed an energetic blueprint, a template determining health, balance, and function. Disease occurred when this blueprint became distorted or fragmented, when emotional trauma, environmental stress, or spiritual disconnection disrupted the flow of energy that sustained the body. Jesus understood this blueprint with a clarity no ordinary healer possessed. He did not diagnose outward symptoms. He perceived the underlying pattern that had fractured. When he placed his hands upon the sick, he was not transferring divine power or performing supernatural feats. He was reaching into the energetic architecture that governed their physical form and rewriting the damaged portions, restoring coherence where chaos had taken root. His touch did not force change. It invited the body to remember its original state, its unbroken design. James felt the magnitude of this truth pulse through him like a deep, slow shock. Astra revealed that Jesus' healing ability was not a unique gift, not something the universe reserved for a chosen few. It was an expression of an awakened consciousness, operating from a higher understanding of how reality functioned. Anyone who reached that level of awareness could perceive the energetic blueprint. Anyone could influence it. The limitation was not in capacity, but in perception. Humanity had simply forgotten how to see. Astra pressed further, revealing that emotions played a critical role in shaping the blueprint. Fear constricted it, Grief weakened it. Hatred fractured it. Love, presence, and forgiveness strengthened it, restoring alignment. Jesus' presence alone often catalyzed healing because his consciousness resonated at a frequency that reminded others of their own wholeness. In many cases, the sick were healed before he even touched them, their blueprints stabilizing in response to the energetic field he carried. The world had believed Jesus defied nature. Yet the truth was the opposite. He understood nature so completely that the boundary between healing and miracle dissolved. James felt the chapel tremble with the weight of it. Healing had never been magic. It had been remembrance. The chapel felt colder as Astra unveiled a truth that pressed against the edges of James's understanding, stretching it in ways that made his thoughts feel unsteady. The story of Lazarus had always been one of the most astonishing accounts of Jesus' ministry, a moment often cited as the ultimate proof of divine power. But Astra began reshaping that story, peeling back the layers of myth to expose a reality far more intricate and far more unsettling than a simple return from death. Lazarus had not been resurrected, he had been retrieved. Astra conveyed that between life and full transition lay a boundary realm, a liminal plane where consciousness hovered when the separation from the body was incomplete. It was not heaven, nor was it a hallucination. It was a threshold, a place where disembodied awareness lingered in confusion, neither fully attached to the physical, nor fully embraced by the next stage. Transition beings like Astra navigated this realm effortlessly, guiding souls who struggled to detach or who resisted the passage into the greater field of existence. Lazarus had entered this boundary after his body ceased functioning. His consciousness drifted in a suspended state, unable to cross completely because fear, pain, and unfinished attachments anchored him. Astra conveyed that Jesus sensed this immediately when he arrived at Lazarus's tomb. He did not approach the situation as an opportunity for spectacle or demonstration. He approached it as a retrieval. Jesus' awareness, expanded after the blooming, allowed him to perceive the boundary realm with clarity. He could feel where Lazarus was, not by sight or sound, but by resonance, the vibrational signature of a consciousness trapped between worlds. The moment Jesus called Lazarus, he was not summoning a corpse back to life. He was reaching into the threshold, extending a pull toward the wandering awareness lingering in confusion. Jesus' voice carried a frequency that cut through the fog of that realm, guiding Lazarus back toward his body, anchoring him again to the physical form that had not fully released him. Lazarus returned not because death had been undone, but because the transition had not completed. The separation cord had not fully dissolved, and Jesus' intervention redirected the process before it became irreversible. James felt a ripple of awe and unease through his chest. The miracle of Lazarus was not a violation of life and death. It was a profound understanding of the spaces in between. Astra revealed that Jesus did not act alone in that moment. Members of the Council of 12 Lights stood unseen at the edges of reality, stabilizing the boundary as Jesus reached across it. What the world called resurrection had actually been a rescue from a realm where many souls became lost when fear clouded the passage forward. Lazarus walked again not because Jesus commanded life, but because Jesus understood the fragile doorway where life and afterlife touched. A deeper quiet filled the chapel, a stillness so complete that James felt as though the building itself were holding its breath. Astra began unveiling another truth, one that pressed against James's mind like a slow tide of light. When Jesus crossed into the boundary realm during the retrieval of Lazarus, he had not only reached for a wandering consciousness, he had seen what most living minds were never meant to witness. Astra conveyed that this crossing was not accidental. It was the moment that revealed to Jesus the greater architecture of existence, the moment that reshaped the direction of his teachings forever. James felt impressions rising within him, not images but sensations of something vast and luminous. The realm beyond the boundary did not resemble a place. It resembled awareness itself. There, form dissolved into vibration, identity into presence. Jesus, even with his expanded consciousness, had stepped into this threshold only briefly, yet what he encountered altered the way he understood his mission. Astra revealed that Jesus did not walk alone in that realm. He perceived luminous consciousnesses that existed without shape, beings who communicated not with words but through resonance. Their presence felt like a merging of intention and understanding, a silent exchange of truth that bypassed language entirely. These luminous intelligences did not instruct him in doctrine or command. They reflected his own, remembering back to him. In their radiance, he recognized the nature of the source more clearly than ever before. He sensed that all beings were fragments of a single field of creation, each carrying within them the spark of the same essence he embodied so fully. This recognition deepened his compassion, not because he saw humanity as fragile, but because he saw it as profoundly connected, deeply unaware of its own origin. Astra impressed upon James that the encounter illuminated something else. Jesus realized that suffering came not from punishment or destiny, but from disconnection. Every human struggle, every fear, every moment of cruelty or despair arose from forgetting the luminous truth that lived beneath the surface of existence. When Jesus returned from the threshold, he carried this understanding with him like a resonance that pulsed through everything he touched. His teachings shifted subtly but powerfully. He spoke more often of light, of the kingdom within, of unity with the source. He emphasized forgiveness not as moral duty, but as a way to dissolve the barriers that separated individuals from one another and from their own deeper nature. He healed with a certainty shaped by what he had witnessed, knowing the blueprint beneath every living being was already whole. James felt the revelation settle over him like a shadow woven from light. What Jesus had seen in that realm was not a vision of divine hierarchy, but a remembrance of profound unity, and that glimpse of the luminous consciousnesses had changed the course of his life, and through him, the course of humanity. A deeper tension gathered around James as Astra revealed the next truth, a truth that carried a weight far heavier than politics or power struggles. The story humanity had been told about why Jesus was hunted was only the outer shell of a much larger and more unsettling reality. Rome feared rebellion. That much was true, but their fear was predictable and rooted in control. The temple authorities, however, feared something far older and far more profound. They feared what Jesus was awakening in the minds of ordinary people. It was not his teachings about compassion or humility that threatened them. It was the knowledge he carried. Knowledge humanity was never meant to access so soon. Astra conveyed that long before Jesus arrived, ancient councils of spiritual and non-human intelligences monitored the development of civilizations. Humanity was considered fragile, young, and prone to self-destruction when granted power beyond its emotional maturity. Certain truths about consciousness, creation, and the nature of the soul were deliberately hidden, guarded to prevent early misuse. When Jesus awakened fully and began revealing the deeper universal laws, he disrupted the timeline humanity was supposed to follow. His miracles exposed the malleability of reality. His teachings implied that every person carried within them the same potential, and his clarity revealed paths to awakening that bypassed institutions entirely. James felt a cold pressure tighten in his chest as Astra pressed this understanding into him. When Jesus healed without ritual, he undermined the authority of the priesthood. When he taught that the kingdom was within, he rendered temples secondary. When he described the source as an intimate presence rather than a distant ruler, he shattered the power structure built on intermediaries. The authorities saw not a preacher but a threat to the architecture of control that had shaped civilization for generations. Astra communicated something deeper still. Jesus had begun revealing fragments of advanced spiritual science that echoed knowledge held by ancient mystery schools, knowledge that had been restricted since the earliest ages. He spoke of light in ways that resembled descriptions of consciousness fields. He described unity with the Source in terms resembling the energetic truths Astra had shown to James. These teachings were not metaphors. They were keys, and those in power recognized the danger. Rome feared revolt, but the temple authorities feared evolution. If humanity realized its own nature, its own capacity, its own connection to something infinite, no empire, religious or political, could hold dominance. Jesus did not threaten their doctrines. He threatened their foundation. His presence exposed the brittle structure of authority and revealed a truth older than Scripture, that divinity was not separate from humanity, but woven into it. James felt the revelation sink deep, unsettling yet luminous. Jesus was not hunted because he broke rules. He was hunted because he broke illusions. A heavy quiet fell over James as Astra shifted the direction of the revelations, guiding him toward a night humanity believed it understood, a night etched into Scripture as the ultimate act of treachery. But Astra made clear that the story told for 2,000 years was only a shadow of the truth. The betrayal that defined Judas had never been betrayal at all. It had been coordination, a decision woven through layers of understanding far deeper than any human account had ever captured. James felt the weight of that statement press against him, unsettling and magnetic, as Astra began to unravel the events of that night. Astra conveyed that Jesus knew the path ahead long before his final days. He understood the consequences of revealing truths that threatened the foundations of authority. He sensed the growing tension around him, recognized the fear stirring within religious leaders, and perceived the inevitability of conflict. But rather than resisting it, he prepared for it, not out of resignation, but out of purpose. Jesus understood that his physical life formed only one strand of a much greater design, and the moment of his capture needed to unfold with precision to prevent greater violence. For that to happen, someone had to act as the bridge between his inner circle and the authorities waiting for a moment to strike. Judas was not chosen because he was weak. He was chosen because he was trusted. Astra revealed that Jesus shared with him knowledge the others were not ready to carry. He told Judas that the transition of his earthly role needed to occur at a specific hour, under specific conditions, with minimal conflict to protect the others. Judas understood the gravity of this and agreed, not as a betrayer but as a participant in a plan none of the remaining disciples could comprehend. James felt the shock settle in his bones as Astra impressed the truth deeper. Judas acted out of loyalty, not greed. The silver he received was symbolic, not motivating, a seal to ensure the authorities believed the exchange was genuine. The sorrow Judas carried afterward was not born from guilt of betrayal, but from witnessing the suffering Jesus had foreseen and accepted. Humanity had condemned him for acting within a role he never chose for himself but embraced because the path required it. Astra revealed that Jesus ensured the others never learned the full truth during their lifetimes. Their grief and confusion would have clouded the purpose of the event, and human history shaped Judas's legacy through interpretations shaped by emotion rather than understanding. James sensed the tragedy within the revelation. A man remembered as a villain had, in truth, carried one of the heaviest burdens of devotion. The night of betrayal had never been treachery. It had been a coordinated act, a necessary step in a process too vast for those present to see. And as the truth settled over him, James felt the boundaries of the familiar story dissolve into something far more mysterious and profoundly human. A deeper gravity filled the chapel, as if the air thickened around James, preparing him for a truth that had been sealed beneath centuries of ritual and doctrine. Astra began revealing the reality of the crucifixion in a way that felt both shocking and strangely inevitable, as though the world had sensed fragments of it without ever daring to acknowledge the whole. The crucifixion, Astra conveyed, had not been the end. It had not even been the moment of departure. Jesus had not waited for his body to fail. He had chosen the moment of separation long before the last breath left his lungs. Astra placed the understanding into James's mind with a gentle precision. Jesus possessed an awareness so expanded after the blooming that he could navigate the boundary between the physical and the non-physical with deliberate intention. Pain, suffering, and the slow collapse of the body were not what freed him. Instead, he released his consciousness voluntarily, stepping into a higher state even as the physical form remained suspended on the cross. The world believed his final cry marked the moment of death. But Astra revealed that this cry was an energetic signal, the point at which Jesus detached completely from the limitations of the flesh. James felt impressions rising within him, the sense of Jesus hovering above his own body, witnessing the unfolding scene not with fear but with a profound clarity. From this elevated state, Jesus perceived the grief of those who loved him, the hostility of those who condemned him, and the confusion of those who watched without understanding. He saw every emotion as ripples in a field of consciousness. And for a moment, he embraced all of it, not from within the pain but from beyond it. Astra revealed that Jesus had mastered the transition process to such a degree that he could hold awareness in multiple layers of reality at once. While the physical form succumbed to its wounds, his consciousness stabilized in the threshold between worlds. He was neither bound to the body nor fully ascended. He hovered in the in-between, gathering strength for what would come next. This liminal state was intentional. It allowed him to complete a final act of teaching, one humanity would struggle for centuries to decipher. James felt a shiver pass through him as Astra pressed the final part of the truth into his thoughts. Jesus' departure from the body had been an act of sovereignty, not defeat. He left before suffering claimed him, stepping into a higher dimension with a precision only an awakened consciousness could achieve. The crucifixion had not ended his presence. It had transformed it, and from that higher vantage, he waited for the moment when he would return, not as flesh restored, but as consciousness reshaped by light. Astra allowed the space around James to thicken with an almost electric anticipation, as if the truth he was about to reveal required the chapel itself to steady. The ascension was one of the most dramatized moments in Scripture, often imagined as Jesus rising physically into the sky, carried by divine power into some distant realm. But Astra began to dissolve that familiar image, replacing it with something far more intricate, far more mysterious, and infinitely more aligned with the deeper laws of the universe. The ascension, Astra conveyed, had not been movement through space. It had been movement through frequency. James felt the revelation arrive not as words, but as a shift in perception. Astra began to demonstrate what Jesus had truly done. The energetic form Jesus used after the resurrection was already vibrating at a frequency higher than physical matter, but still anchored enough to remain visible and tangible when needed. The ascension was the moment he released that final anchor. Instead of rising, he intensified the vibration of his consciousness until the energetic body he had constructed could no longer be perceived by human senses. Astra guided James into a state of heightened awareness, lifting the veil of ordinary perception so he could witness the demonstration firsthand. The chapel around him blurred, not in movement, but in density. Walls softened. Light thickened. Astra's form began to waver, not fading but shifting, as though passing into a spectrum James had never known existed. It was not disappearance. It was translation. Astra showed him how reality behaved when a consciousness elevated its frequency beyond the perceptual range of the human mind. James felt a tremor ripple through him as Astra impressed the memory of Jesus' ascension. The event had taken place in front of his followers, but what they witnessed was only the surface of a much deeper phenomenon. They saw a radiant figure becoming less distinct, more luminous, as if dissolving into brilliance. They interpreted it with the limited vocabulary available to them, rising upward. Yet Jesus had not moved vertically. He had expanded. The energetic form grew subtler, brighter, and more diffuse as Jesus attuned fully to dimensions beyond physical measurement. His followers watched a shift they could not fully understand, described through symbols rather than science. Astra conveyed that this transformation did not sever Jesus from humanity. Instead, it freed him from the limitations of form, allowing him to exist as a field of consciousness accessible to those whose awareness had begun to awaken. The ascension was not departure, it was reconfiguration. Emerging with the luminous realm he had touched during the 7 minutes after death, now fully realized, James felt a strange awe settle in his chest. The idea that Jesus had not left the world, but had shifted into a frequency where only the open-hearted could perceive him, reshaped everything he thought he knew. Astra allowed the vision to fade slowly, leaving James with the unmistakable understanding that the ascension had never been about leaving Earth. It had been about returning to his true nature. Astra allowed a colder silence to descend, a silence that felt almost deliberate, as though the truth he was about to reveal required the world itself to pause. James sensed it immediately, a heaviness settling over his chest that made each breath feel slower, deeper, weighted with anticipation. Astra began placing the revelation into his mind with careful precision, as if unveiling a truth humanity had subconsciously feared for centuries. Jesus' real message had not been forgotten. It had been buried, and it had been buried with purpose. Astra conveyed that every civilization, no matter how advanced or primitive, developed systems of authority. These systems relied on a simple equation. Those in power required the people to remain unaware of their own inner strength. True empowerment threatened structure. True sovereignty threatened hierarchy. If humans realized the depth of their connection to the source, if they understood the universal law Jesus demonstrated, if they recognized their capacity to heal, to create, to transform reality through intention and consciousness, then no institution could govern them through fear or obedience. James felt a tightening in his stomach as Astra pressed this truth deeper. After Jesus' departure, the leaders of emerging religious and political institutions faced a problem they could not ignore. Jesus had revealed too much. His teachings, if preserved in their pure form, would have awakened individuals rather than formed congregations. They promoted direct connection to the source rather than dependence on intermediaries. They encouraged inner revelation rather than external authority. They taught that the kingdom was not distant, but within, and that no priest, ruler, or empire had dominion over a soul awakened to its own nature. Astra showed James the fear that rippled through the early councils. They understood that a society of empowered individuals could not be easily controlled, taxed, or manipulated. People who recognized their own divinity would not kneel out of fear, accept suffering as destiny, or believe salvation required obedience. So the councils removed, altered, or diluted every teaching that pointed inward. They replaced inner awakening with ritual. They replaced personal sovereignty with submission. They framed Jesus as an unreachable exception rather than an example. In doing so, they shifted the foundation of spirituality from empowerment to dependency. James felt the weight of centuries press against him. Astra revealed that this suppression was not solely motivated by malice, but by fear. Fear of chaos, fear of losing power, fear of humanity evolving faster than society could manage. But regardless of intention, the result remained the same. A message meant to liberate became a system built to confine. Spirituality became hierarchy. Connection became doctrine. And awakening became blasphemy. Astra impressed the final truth gently but firmly. Empowered humans cannot be controlled. Their minds cannot be colonized. Their spirits cannot be owned. This was the truth Jesus carried, and this was the truth the world was never meant to access. The burial of his message was not an accident of history. It was a strategy of survival for the systems built in his name. Astra allowed the atmosphere around James to soften, as if preparing him for a truth that did not strike with force, but unfolded with the quiet inevitability of dawn. The chapel seemed to breathe, its shadows deepening as though retreating to make room for what was about to rise. Astra began placing the revelation into James's awareness with a gentleness that felt almost reverent. This truth, he conveyed, was the heart of everything Jesus came to offer humanity. It was the message that had been diluted, reshaped, and concealed beneath centuries of interpretation. Jesus did not come to elevate himself. He came to elevate everyone. James felt a slow warmth spread through his mind as Astra revealed the central truth. Every human being, without exception, was a fragment of the same source. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. The consciousness that animated the universe, the radiance that existed before matter formed, lived within each person as a spark of the same infinite essence. Jesus embodied this truth with unusual clarity, but he was not separate from humanity. He was not an isolated miracle. He was a reminder of what humanity had always been. Astra conveyed that Jesus' mission was not to create worshippers. It was to awaken equals. When he spoke of the kingdom within, he was not offering comfort. He was offering identity. When he performed acts that seemed impossible, he was demonstrating potential. When he described himself as the light of the world, he meant that all beings carried that same light, hidden beneath layers of fear, conditioning, and forgetfulness. His teachings pointed inward, urging individuals to rediscover the divine spark that had always existed beneath the surface of their lives. James sensed the magnitude of this truth, a revelation that felt both intimate and overwhelming. Astra showed him how Jesus had tried repeatedly to make humanity see that divinity was not a distant presence but an internal reality. He taught that love was not a moral instruction but the natural expression of recognizing the source in oneself and in others. He explained that forgiveness was not an obligation, but a release that restored alignment with one's true nature. Every teaching, every parable, every moment of compassion was designed to guide people back toward the realization of their own origin. Astra pressed deeper, revealing that Jesus saw no hierarchy of souls, no chosen class, no spiritual elite. Every person, regardless of circumstance, carried the same potential for awakening. The divine spark was not greater in a prophet than in a child, not stronger in a sage than in a laborer. The difference was awareness, not worth. Jesus intended humanity to understand that they were equal in divinity, equal in potential, equal in the capacity to shape reality through consciousness. James felt the truth settle in him like a slow-burning fire. This message, Astra conveyed, was the one the world was never allowed to keep. If humanity realized its own nature, no system could contain it. Jesus came not to be the exception, but to reveal that there were no exceptions. All were fragments of the same source, and all were meant to remember. Astra allowed a faint, almost electric hum to settle into the chapel, the kind of sensation James had come to recognize as the precursor to a truth that carried consequences beyond personal understanding. The air felt charged, as if the world outside the walls were leaning closer, waiting to hear what would be revealed. Slowly, with deliberate clarity, Astra began placing the next revelation into James's awareness. Humanity stood on the edge of something vast, something ancient, something inevitable. A coming remembering, a shift Jesus had foreseen long before it began. James felt a stirring within him, a subtle vibration that seemed to echo through his bones. Astra conveyed that humanity had been moving toward a threshold for generations. A slow and uneven evolution of consciousness shaped by struggle, curiosity, and a quiet hunger for something beyond the material world. This awakening was not sudden. It was the culmination of thousands of years of searching, forgetting, and rediscovering fragments of truth buried beneath fear and tradition. Now the threshold stood closer than ever before, closer than governments, religions, or institutions were prepared to acknowledge. Astra revealed that this awakening was not about miracles or dramatic events. It was about memory, not memory of past lives or ancient civilizations, but memory of identity, memory of the source within, memory of the same truth Jesus carried when he walked the earth. As human consciousness expanded, the structures built to contain it began to weaken. Dogma loosened, fear fractured. Old systems struggled to maintain influence over minds that were slowly beginning to question, not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. James felt Astra's impressions deepen, showing him glimpses of individuals across the world experiencing subtle shifts. Ordinary people sensing a pull toward introspection. Others questioning realities they once accepted without thought. Some awakening to empathy that felt newly intense. Some experiencing intuitive knowing that defied explanation. Astra explained that these were not anomalies. They were early signs of the remembering. The collective mind of humanity was beginning to rise into frequencies once accessible only to sages, mystics, and awakened individuals like Jesus. Yet Astra also conveyed that with awakening came resistance. Those who benefited from a world shaped by fear and division would attempt to suppress this rising consciousness. Information would be distorted. Distraction would be amplified. Conflict would be stirred to keep humanity from recognizing its own potential. But despite every effort, the remembering would not be stopped. It was encoded into the destiny of the species, a cycle that repeated across civilizations on countless worlds. Every culture eventually reached this threshold. Some embraced it, others collapsed under the weight of their own refusal. James felt a cold shiver pass through him as Astra pressed the final truth of the chapter into his thoughts. Jesus had foreseen this awakening. He had taught not just for his time, but for this time. The world was approaching the moment when humanity would either rise into the truth of its nature or fall deeper into the illusion of separation. The coming remembering was not a prophecy. It was a choice, and that choice was already unfolding. Astra allowed the silence to deepen until it felt almost alive, a presence woven into the air itself. James sensed immediately that everything he had been shown, everything he had been led through, had been preparing him for this final truth. The chapel seemed suspended outside of time, as if the world had paused to listen. Astra's presence grew denser, more luminous, and James felt a heaviness settle into his chest, the unmistakable weight of something his mind was not yet ready to hold. Then, with a softness that made the revelation even more devastating, Astra began to show him why he had come now. The truth arrived not in words, but in a flood of understanding that shook James to the core. Jesus had never been meant to stand alone. He was not an exception carved out by divine favor. He was an example, an awakened human demonstrating what every person was capable of becoming once they remembered their origin. This was the truth that had been buried, the truth that had frightened rulers and institutions for centuries. If humanity realized that Jesus was a mirror rather than a monument, the world would never again bow to anything outside itself. James felt the revelation tear through him, equal parts awe and dread. Everything he had been taught unraveled at once. The gulf between divinity and humanity dissolved. Jesus had shown what it meant to live with consciousness fully awakened, not as a being set apart, but as a being fully aligned with the source within all life. Astra pressed deeper, showing James that countless individuals across history had carried fragments of this awakening, but none had ignited it as powerfully as Jesus. And now, for the first time since those distant days, humanity was approaching the same threshold again. Astra conveyed that this was the reason for his arrival. Not to share cosmic history, not to expose hidden truths, but to prepare James for a role he never imagined he possessed. James was not chosen for his spiritual pedigree, nor for knowledge or status. He was chosen because his years of standing at the edge of life and death had carved a space within him that could hold the truth without distortion. He was chosen because he was already a bridge between worlds without ever realizing it. The final revelation pressed into him with a force that felt like light turning into gravity. Astra explained that James's purpose was not to witness the truth. Witnessing was passive. Remembering was only the beginning. James's purpose was to carry the truth into a world trembling on the verge of transformation. His words, his presence, his understanding would ripple outward, touching minds ready to awaken. He was meant to help guide humanity through the coming remembering, not as a prophet, but as a reminder. James felt his breath shake as the enormity of it settled inside him. Jesus had been the first spark. Humanity would be the flame, and Astra had come now because the world was finally ready to burn with its own light. The night did not end when James left the chapel. It did not dissolve into silence or retreat into the comforting rhythms of ordinary time. Instead, it lingered like a held breath, as if the world itself had paused to witness what one human mind had just been forced to confront. The echo of Astra's presence clung to the air long after the glowing form faded, leaving the chapel suspended in a strange twilight between the known and the forbidden. James stepped into the hallway, not as a mere witness of something extraordinary, but as someone who had crossed a threshold that no one was ever meant to cross. And with that crossing came a weight he had not chosen yet could no longer set down. He moved through the sterile quiet of the hospital corridor, but it no longer felt like a place built of walls and light. Every fluorescent bulb seemed to hum at a frequency he had never noticed until this night. Every reflective surface seemed to distort slightly at the edges, as if struggling to contain the truth he carried. The nurses at the station, unaware of the cosmic shift that had unfolded behind the chapel door, continued their routines with weary familiarity. Clipboards were checked, machines were reset, digital logs updated. To them, it was another night, indistinguishable from countless others. To James, it had become the night that divided his life into two halves, before the revelation and after it. He walked deeper into the hallway, but the memory of Astra's glow followed him. There was no running from it now, no waking up from a strange dream, no logical explanation to soothe the rational part of his mind. The truth had not been whispered or suggested. It had been delivered with a clarity that shattered every quiet assumption James had ever held about reality, consciousness, divinity, the afterlife, and humanity's forgotten origins. The being who emerged from the shadows had not come to perform miracles or offer salvation. Astra had come to expose a truth hidden beneath centuries of doctrine and fear, a truth intentionally buried because of the destabilizing power it carried. James reached the end of the hall, stopping before the wide window that overlooked the dark parking lot below. The reflection of his face stared back at him. The same afro hair, the same tired eyes, the same lines etched by years of grief, compassion, and witnessing the final moments of countless lives. Yet something behind those eyes had changed. Something ancient had awakened. Something he could not name, yet felt pulsing beneath his ribcage like a second heartbeat. It was the unmistakable knowledge that humanity was far more than flesh and bone, far more than belief and tradition. It was the realization that humans were fragments of the same eternal source that breathed existence into galaxies, not lesser beings, not children waiting for cosmic permission to grow, equals in potential, dormant in awareness. The city beyond the window glowed with scattered streetlights, unaware that its ancient story had been rewritten in a single night. Somewhere in the sprawl of houses, apartments, highways, and neon signs, millions of people slept without knowing that the truth they had never been allowed to hold was now resting in the mind of a single hospice nurse. James pressed his palm lightly against the glass, feeling the cold surface beneath his skin. It grounded him, reminding him that the world outside still operated according to the rules he had always believed in. Traffic lights, schedules, mortgages, arguments, secrets, prayers, whispered before bed. Yet beneath all these human rituals, a deeper reality pulsed like an underground river, finally beginning to rise. James knew what Astra meant by the coming remembering. He sensed it now in the quiet hum of the lights, in the faint tremble of the window pane, in the way his own breath felt different inside his chest. Humanity was not drifting toward a prophetic catastrophe or a celestial judgment. It was drifting toward itself, toward an awakening that had been delayed, distorted, and denied for so many centuries that the world forgot it was even possible. Jesus had seen it. Astra had confirmed it. The threshold was not a myth. It was a cycle that had happened on countless worlds before this one, always emerging when a species reached the edge of its forgetting. James stepped away from the window, his footsteps softer now, as though he feared disturbing the fragile balance between the world he knew and the world waiting beneath it. He passed by the patient rooms lined along the hall. Behind each door lay someone fighting their own battles, clinging to breath, memory, or the last threads of a fading life. He had seen the glossy film of fear in their eyes, heard the trembling echoes of their regrets, and felt the weight of their unresolved stories. Yet now, with Astra's revelations burning through his mind, he saw something else. Every patient, every stranger, every grieving family member was carrying within them the same spark Jesus had carried. The same spark that could shape reality, heal the body, transcend the physical, and return to the source with full awareness instead of confusion. The thought overwhelmed him. It felt too large for the mind he had lived with his entire life, too vast for the identity he had grown into. He wondered how many people had come close to knowing this truth only to be silenced by fear, resistance, or the quiet machinery of institutions built on control. He wondered how many had felt glimpses of it in moments of death, in visions, in dreams, only to have it dismissed as hallucination or myth. And he wondered why he, of all people, had been chosen to hold this truth now. Astra's explanation echoed through him. James had not been selected because he was special in the way religions defined specialness. He had not been chosen because he was a prophet or a scholar or a mystic. He had been chosen because he had lived his life with one foot on the threshold, witnessing the transition between worlds more times than he could count. He had held the hands of the dying, comforted the grieving, and walked through the emotional landscapes of endings that most people avoided. He had unwittingly become a bridge, softened by the spiritual gravity of death, yet grounded in the physical world. His sensitivity had formed not through training or doctrine, but through compassion. The memory of Dorothy flickered through his mind. The patient whose final wish had summoned Astra into the room. She had known what James had refused to see. She had sensed that he was ready, even if he had not believed it himself. Her passing had not been an ending. It had been the turning of a key in a door he had never realized existed. Through her final breath, the ancient truth had entered his world. And now, like it or not, he was the one carrying it. James walked slowly toward the elevator, the hum of the machine vibrating faintly through the floor. He pressed the button and waited for the doors to open. As he stood there, another sensation crept into his awareness, a subtle pull. It felt like gravity, but not physical gravity. It tugged not at his body, but at something inside him that had been blanketed and dormant for his entire life. The more he acknowledged it, the more it intensified, like a whisper trying to become a voice. He entered the elevator, and as the doors slid shut, the world contracted into a small, enclosed space. The descending hum filled the silence around him, yet his thoughts drifted far beyond the hospital walls. He imagined what would happen if the truth Astra revealed were spoken in the open. How would the world respond if it learned that Jesus had not been sent to create a religion, but to awaken humanity to its own dormant divinity? How would governments react if people realized they were not spiritually helpless, not dependent on intermediaries, not bound by dogmas that stripped them of sovereignty? How would the institutions built over centuries protect themselves when the foundation they rested upon began to crumble? The elevator doors opened onto the first floor, but James remained still for a moment before stepping out. His entire body seemed to vibrate with the remnants of Astra's presence. The lobby was quiet, lit by soft lamps and flickering screens displaying patient statuses. A security guard nodded at him, unaware that the man crossing the lobby was carrying a revelation capable of shaking the world. James exited the hospital and stepped into the cold night air. The wind brushed against his skin, grounding him in the physical world again. The parking lot glistened with reflections from overhead lights, puddles shimmering from an earlier rain. The air tasted electric, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. He stopped at the edge of the lot, staring up at the vast sky above. The stars flickered like distant embers. For the first time in his life, they did not seem far or unreachable. They felt connected, like threads of a larger design stretching across space and time. He understood now why Astra had come. Not to frighten him, not to confuse him, but to prepare him. Everything Jesus had taught had been meant to plant a seed. Everything institutions built afterward had been designed to keep the seed buried. And everything happening now in the world was pushing humanity toward the moment when that buried seed would crack open and reveal the memory that had always belonged to them. James inhaled slowly, letting the cold air fill his lungs. The world looked the same, but it was not the same. The truth was now inside him, pulsing with quiet electricity. He was not required to shout it from rooftops or challenge institutions head-on. Astra had not given him a mission of confrontation. He had given him a mission of remembering. The truth would not change the world through force. It would change it through awakening. Through individuals who recognized the spark within themselves and began to live from that awareness. Through conversations, through compassion. James walked toward his car, each step heavier yet strangely lighter. The coming days would not be easy. The truth he carried would not leave him untouched. It would shape him, challenge him, and call him into depths he had never explored. But he would not walk blindly. Astra had made that clear. The remembering would guide him. The connection to the source would sustain him, and the spark within him would lead him where he needed to go. As he opened the car door, he paused once more, looking up at the night sky. The stars shimmered like ancient witnesses. Somewhere out there beyond human understanding, Astra's kind continued their silent observation, waiting for humanity to rise into its own forgotten light. James lowered himself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove into the darkness, carrying the truth that had been hidden for millennia. A truth that would no longer remain in the dark. A truth that was now alive. A truth that would change everything.